Dum, dum, dum. Dum, 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 dum. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. In fact, we have all of those time zones currently on this podcast. Welcome down to Security Rabbit Hole, everybody, to another edition of the Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast. I am Raf. James is. I'm not sure which window you are, but you're there somewhere.
I'm feeling like we've completely hit the global market here. If we can hit all time zones, or not all time zones, but at least all breakfast, lunch, and dinner all at the same time.
Yeah, we're getting there. So East Coast, it's 9:30. Mattias, introduce yourself and tell us where in the world you are.
So my name is Mattias Wahlen, and I'm in Sweden.
Where it's afternoon, there you go. See, there it is.
Yes.
And in the early breakfast, we've got Joe.
Hi, Joe Slowik. I'm coming to you from the U.S. Mountain West. It's 7:30, not too bad here.
That's not too bad. And then, Karim, where in the world are you?
I'm East Coast for now, Raf. Luckily, I'm in Boston, so I'm pretty much same time zone you're in.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so all right, East Coast. Awesome, guys. Welcome to the show, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Those of you that have. All right, getting right down to it. There's been a lot of chatter. There has been a lot of maybe interesting isn't the word, but there's been a lot of alarm around the current Russian attack on Ukraine and what it has meant for cyber operations. There's been some guidance released that Russian assets are going to be levying attacks against American interests, et cetera, et cetera. I thought now would be a really good time to separate some of that fact from fiction. So I gathered a bunch of you guys who definitely would have some expertise in this. And let's start with this question. As far as I know, this isn't the first opportunity that we've been able to say that, hey, Russia's trying to get all up in our systems and cause havoc. Am I wrong? And whoever wants to take it, just go.
Well, I think it's breaking that apart into two statements that the Russians are trying to get all up in our systems and then to cause havoc. I think it's important to separate those because we've certainly seen the former. The latter, outside of specific circumstances, we haven't seen, which I think is an interesting data point to keep in mind, even with some of the indictments that were they were publicly revealed. They came out in 2021 and then were just released a couple of weeks ago for the Berserk Bear, Crouching Yeti, Dragonfly, whatever you want to call them actor. They've been up in our systems for several years, for a decade almost, but with no real effect, as opposed to what we've seen from entities like Sandworm operating primarily in Ukraine. So there's this distinction between what's been going on in areas of conflict or latent conflict, such as in the Ukrainian sphere, versus everywhere else where we've certainly seen lots of access, lots of poking around, so to speak, but there was an inflammatory comment made by someone from CISA a few years ago that they had their finger on the button or their hands on the switch, so to speak. And that might be true, but no one's ever pushed it or thrown the switch, or at least not yet. But it's still concerning, though.
Yeah, I'd echo that sentiment, Joe. Go ahead, Mattias. Okay, had a point to make.
No, I would say the same. I would just add the difference that I think it was also helpful to understand the Russian concept of hybrid warfare. We like to think of terms of war and peace as two very different states, and it's important to keep the boundary between them as wide as possible. Whereas the Russian idea of hybrid warfare means that there is a conflict, and this conflict can be at various levels of severity. And I think the important part is that from their perspective, from how they teach hybrid warfare, the West is now in a hybrid war with Russia. Our sanctions is a financial attack on Russia that is perfectly within the realm of hybrid warfare. So the question is, according to the Russians' definition, will they respond? If you hurt my economy, I will hurt your economy.
I would also add to this one piece, just to give you some context. I think, Joe said it also, which is that this pretty, at least to the mainstream, groundbreaking revelation, they've been in our systems for a long time. No, I mean, I don't think any of us should be surprised. And in fact, that will continue. That latent, dormant infiltration and persistence and lateral movement is hallmark, right? And I think that that's more important to them, to have that level of intimidation, to be able to be in these systems, or at least build that myth broadly, maybe even more broadly than what it really is, because that's even more effective, because they've caused an immense amount of panic and concerns, and people are scrambling to try to root out threat here fairly unsuccessfully, I might add, partially because they've just been able to build that notional idea. We see it, as you know, what we do, and we can confirm that, yeah, look, this embedding is a very, very key part of it. But that, of course, dovetails in all these other things about attribution. Who knows if it's really them or if it's been brokered to some other nation state? We can get that later.
Does that change how people, though, are addressing this? Because you see people on the news talking about, oh, it's a heightened state, but does it change having the fact that we already assume they're there, basically, versus start watching your network traffic to see if they're trying to come in, right? Mm-hmm. So are a lot of people actually looking at the wrong space and saying, okay, I'm looking to see if they're coming, and it's like, wait, you're looking at the wrong path. You need to be looking at what's going out, not what's coming in. And I just wonder how that affects that, with the idea, the notion that we should assume that they've probably got access.
You're right, James. You hear how noisy I am. I'm like, look, I'm all appreciative and will never not endorse good hygiene and vulnerability assessments. All that's fine. But it's this whole idea, please divest this, stop conflating vulnerability with compromise. Two different things. If there's an active infiltration and manifestation in an environment, that's well beyond vulnerability. And frankly, most of these sophisticated groups, like what Joe's talking about and what Mattias is referencing, they're not using a conventional vulnerability to get in. They're getting in through social engineering and phishing, and no amount of pen testing is going to stop that.
No, and I also think that we have to understand that what we can do is good cybersecurity hygiene. I mean, being able to conduct a proper destructive attack, you need to reconnaissance what's happening. But there's so much reconnaissance happening all the time. The only one who can actually tell us that this is the bad one, the bad threat actor doing it, it's going to be the government themselves. That's what the national intelligence agencies can tell us. No one else can, because we don't have the resources to filter out what is any cyber criminal scanning our port from, the bad one scanning and finding things.
Guys, I'm very curious. Is how different is this than, say, Cold War, right? Because where we knew there was sort of this tension between the two. They were trying to get into our stuff. We were trying to get into theirs. There was espionage on this side, espionage on that side, infiltration, blah, blah, blah. Is it kind of a return to a different battlefield, different theater, same concept?
I can lead with that, at least kick it off with the other team members here. I think we've seen an acceleration and a velocity shift. Really, a very simple answer. Malware is the new spy. It's no longer, an actual covert. There are, but it's a much more efficient, much more scalable agent that allows you to deliver an immense amount of context and information. So I think that, look, the espionage, and I know we're conflating offensive operations with espionage, two completely different things. Very important distinction, especially when it comes to Russia. Two different divisions, but they definitely have cooperation. There's definitely validation to say, I think that this implantation of threat, like we're talking about, is for lay people on this call or watching, it's absolutely a spy, 100% something delivering reconnaissance information, to Mattias's point, back for further action, whatever that might be. So yes, I think we've returned, but we've returned now in a higher velocity, faster cadence. Information flow is immensely more sophisticated and challenging to track.
I think an interesting perspective to keep in mind on this, though, is that if we go back to the halcyon days of 70s, 80s, or even prior, Soviet versus Western espionage activity, yes, you can get really alarming items like the Walker spy ring or similar, where the details leaked or could be disastrous in time of war. But the actual process of gathering Navy crypto information and then sending that off or whatever, is very definitely an espionage action as opposed to deliberately trying to blow something up or take some damage. Whereas we start looking within cyber effects, that while there is a distinct separation in intentions between gathering data and then or trying to impact or affect a system, the prerequisites to get there are the same in many cases. So the same sort of initial access, target development, capability development that you need to steal information or develop information about a given system are all relatively similar to, if not exactly the same, as the steps that would need to go into impacting that system. Like we saw with the Viasat modem wiper that was just, we had the malware analysis that came out last week. Every step prior to that would have been very similar if you were trying to put an implant on those devices in order to use them for collection, except in this case, instead of writing some sort of tool, we just overwrote the devices with garbage code in order to brick them, basically. And so from a escalation management, from a trying to handle, what should our responses be to certain actions, until intention is known to some degree, it becomes very difficult to try to gauge, like, well, is this just standard spycraft espionage activity that we're dealing with here, or does this adversary have the intention to go one step further to deliver some sort of disruptive effect, or even to aim for some cyber physical impact as a result of what they've been able to do?
Well, so the information we've gotten is the intent is to go after energy sector and critical infrastructure. That isn't, as far as I can tell, that's not necessarily news. Like, that's, that the critical infrastructure piece has been a known quantity since we established critical infrastructure protection, and it's been a while. Do you guys, and maybe this is more of a philosophical question, do you guys think that there's a desire on the part of Russian state threat actors to mess with the U.S. power grid, oil production, whatever? I mean, like in real material ways?
If pushed sufficiently, maybe. I don't, Mattias, you look like you were going to say something.
Well, I was going to say, if we look at what we're actually seeing in Ukraine, that is something different. That is essentially cyber war, to the extent that it is a successful but ultimately flawed campaign to degrade the Ukrainian nation's ability to lead the country by destroying government databases, destroying TV news outlets, ways for the government to complete. I mean, ultimately unsuccessful because the plan was designed without social media in mind, and nobody planned for Zelensky to be the mastermind of social media. So
right.
The Ukrainians found new ways to decentralized communication and continue to lead the country. That is not what we're going to see against the West. I will probably start by seeing the kind of things we saw in January, which is fear attacks. Like, for example,
that's right.
What they did is, you create fake social media profiles, spread news that all the banks in Ukraine are hacked and all the accounts are deleted, and then they DDoS the banks. And if people read these social media pages, try to log in, and they can't reach the account.
Well, also, Mattias, you remember that we watched the German elections impacted by the Ghostwriter campaign, right?
Yep.
You can't, as much as we separate an offensive threat or some sort of implant in a critical infrastructure facility as one thing, and then we see disinformation campaigns on the other side. This is still a unified. These are masters of manipulating a general population's view of things, and they've watched how we respond. They've got a Pavlov dogs kind of methodology here, where they can trigger a fear factor on demand almost at this point with some of this. Look, I mean, the CISA, and it was actually an FBI alert that caused the CISA open call. Anyone that was on that, everyone could join. It was primarily founded on the fact that there were IPs that were scanning infrastructure that seemed to have been attributed to a former set of IPs that were attributed to a Russian environment. Bunch of research on that. There's everyone's got an opinion on that one. I'm going to leave that out. But it was just, we're talking about scanning activity that caused an open call for critical infrastructure and all these folks. I joined it. When's that happen? I mean, now we're just literally at the mercy of fear, to Mattias's point. I think that was the part that I totally agree with. I was about to say it before he did.
I think that's interesting. It's interesting.
Right. They could do it.
Yeah.
They could act on it.
Well, that's the interesting part, though, is there seems to, like, the Russians are masters of misinformation, disinformation, sowing, and getting. I mean, they did it significantly with great effect, unfortunately, here in the U.S. With the previous election, with sowing distrust of everything. Right? They've gotten good at that. In a situation where there's a lot more at stake now, considering the madman with the finger on the nuclear button. There's a lot more at stake here. But I think you guys bring up a good point. Is that the attacks aren't necessarily, or the intent of attack and the intent of infiltration and reconnaissance and all that. That's not new. That's been around. It's a matter of, will this become part of, or either a precursor to or a part of, some sort of broader offensive against the West. And I'm curious, Karim, I'll ask you this because you've got literally the data. Are you guys seeing an increased as a observer? Are you seeing an increased number of attacks, an increased number of recon attempts, implantations, that kind of thing?
So we see really an interesting dichotomy. We saw an influx across the board that we can't attribute to everyone's point here, that we're not going to try to make some proclamation that it's one country or another, or a nation state or another, right? That's challenging. So we saw two things. We saw a decline in communications from already implanted infrastructure, which implies intelligent control over the malware to go dark while there was a vigilance to try to find it. So they were guarding their infrastructure from being caught. So it was clear that they were like, all right, everyone's going to get a little bit panicky here in the States. Let's have this go quiet for a few months, and then we'll have it kind of beacon out and say, send the, I'm still alive signal, maybe ask for a fresh version of itself maybe 2 months from now when everything's cooled off, right?
Yeah.
Because they just have to wait us out. So that's one very strange thing that people didn't expect me to say most of the time, which is, no, it actually went quieter in some places. Not because it was rooted out or because there was remediation that happened, unfortunately. I wish that was the reason. It's because the actor that had control over it was smart enough to have the cadence and frequency of its beaconing diminish so it wouldn't be caught as easily. The other side of it is that we watched other nation states piggyback, likely other nation states, let me be clear. Confidence level's high, but it's again, not confirmed, piggybacking on this Russian craziness. And the Russians counted on that. It's misdirection. It's adding introducing noise into signal there to confuse authorities and other cybersecurity researchers. So it's been very hard to divest away, clear. It's all signal. The question is, who is it? Is it actors that are nation state? Is it proxy militia? Is it hacktivists? There's a whole slew of things that have been introduced to this war, to Mattias's point, that makes this very different than the 80s in that way. You got a lot more proxies and a lot more independence than we probably had then, when it was clearly two governments working at each other.
Well, Joe, I'll ask you this a bit in your wheelhouse is looking at what's changed from the 80s and Cold War times is, you could attribute an action to a person because you knew that their literal fingerprints were on it, right? Once they got caught or once they were identified. Karim brought up the proxy idea. Like it's interesting to note that a smart attacker isn't going to sit at their house with their own IP space attributed to Russia and go attack U.S. critical infrastructure. They're going to go compromise somebody else, or get buy an AWS account with Bitcoin, log in from Brazil and attack us. Right? How do we begin to even? Is it A, what's the difficulty in that attribution, and B, is there any danger to trying to do that attribution at this point?
So there's a few questions buried in there. So certainly I think the velocity and the nature of events have made things a bit more difficult than what you'd see with very classic human operations. Although even then, like, is this Stasi? Is this KGB? Is this the Czechs? Is this the Chinese? You would still have questions such as who ultimately is responsible, even if you could take this back to a recruited asset and so forth. But I would like to stress, as much as we as an industry like to say attribution is hard, it is for some people. Don't get me wrong there, but it's not for others. We see this pretty regularly with the steady drumbeat of very specific identification of individuals involved in this activity, whether we're talking about the specific person at Schnickham that was involved in the Triton event, the 4 individuals in FSB behind the Berserk Bear activity, and going on to the various GRU officers that have been identified over the years that yes, it might be very difficult if I have to swim upstream, so to speak, from actual intrusion to operational relay box or so forth, and then on to first principles. But if I could skip that, now if I can compromise an adversary's network and just monitor what they're doing, which maybe some people are doing, things become...
Maybe.
Maybe. If people aren't doing that, I'd say they're not doing their jobs. But if I have that level of access, or combining things with lawful intercept and other items that are outside the realm of most of the commercial sector, although looking at Microsoft's telemetry and their ability to gather information from pretty much any Windows installation, maybe some commercial entities also have insights into this as well. But possibilities exist. Maybe not just for random Twitter user at Bob62194 or whatever, but if I'm talking about the FBI, the NSA, the BND, if I'm talking about entities like a Microsoft or even some of the other large footprint entities, it starts to become possible.
I got a question in our stream here. Joe says, I've seen reports that non-government Russian entities said they would target the West. First, are these truly non-government? Second, any insight into more of that? Anybody want to take that?
Sure, Mattias.
I think that what we see is from both sides an increase in hacktivism. And the hacktivism attacks are like the typical DDoS, it's hacking websites. It's relatively low effort disruption attacks that satisfies the ego to see things happening, and is amplified by the fact that we usually have a pretty ignorant media who doesn't realize and just thinks it's a cyber attack and want the headlines.
Everything's a cyber attack.
Everything is a cyber attack. No, it's not a cyber attack. It's digital graffiti. I mean, if you DDoS a bank, it's like you're parking a van outside the door, so no one can come in. But once the police remove the van, I mean, the money's still safe in there. It preys on the fact that we really don't understand enough, and our journalists don't understand enough, so they just see cyber attack and think it's scary.
Well, let me throw in 2 things, and I'll let Karim and Joe, you guys can respond to it. But there's been a call out from Ukraine for basically, hey, does anyone want to help us, defend the country, and which is one. And then, of course, we all expected Anonymous to jump in, and they've done the disrupting, claim to have done things like disrupting their their national broadcast, which I find particularly hilarious, and other things like that. But and that's arguably non-state sponsored on our side anyway, right?
Well, I think there's something to be said for having a degree of caution when it comes to making these assessments. So if we went back a month, more than a month now, unfortunately, February 24th, when hostilities
24th, that was on my birthday.
Oh, I'm very sorry.
Yeah, that was awesome. Let me tell you.
But anyway, in the week prior to that, as well as in the day itself, many, myself included, were like, where's the cyber? We see some DDoS activity, but there wasn't really clear anything else was going on. And then as time went on, we started realizing or gathering the evidence of seeing this Viasat activity, seeing the manipulation of both for exfiltration and then destruction of various government databases within Ukraine, and the picture becomes more clear over time. So for something like non-state actor or hacktivist or other sorts of activity, yeah, we're seeing some of the most obvious sort of, as Mattias was saying, digital graffiti aspects that are very public in nature. But I would caution anyone else that absence of evidence at this point in time is not evidence of absence completely. I was having this discussion with J.D. Warka a few weeks ago that there needs to be a degree of caution and intellectual honesty that as much as we want these items to be aware or to reveal themselves to us in real time, that we're probably not going to have a complete picture over just what was happening in a electronic warfare and computer network operation perspective around this conflict for months, if not years, when archives are open or someone decides to write their tell-all book or whatever at some point. And so it's a very much a dynamic and evolving situation that we should be cautious that just because we haven't necessarily seen something right now doesn't mean something else hasn't been going on in the background outside of observation.
Well, never mind the whole fog of war thing, right?
Right.
Karim, anything to throw into that?
Yeah, I agree completely. It's funny. I've said this, Joe, you and I on the same wavelength. I've been like, this is, you're not going to get the time compressed version of the story quite yet. I think Sandworm and the whole Petya experience and the way it was portrayed very elegantly by Greenberg, in that book. I mean, while it was fascinating, has given people this sense that that's what's going to happen. Even people in the community were all wrapped up in a wormable event manifesting out of Ukraine this time. It was all that, oh, what about Petya 2 coming up? And, this fear mongering from that point of view. Absolutely possible. I mean, look, I was as much, worried that may indeed be something. I mean, I'm not any different than anyone else, but then to everyone's point here, I completely agree that it's, and then you couple that with what we're seeing, which is latent infiltrations from a long time ago. Had nothing to do with this particular war. This is something from way back when they've, again, I don't know whether this is masterminded by them or if they're just taking the advantage of the situation, which is that we've got them on edge in a perpetually vigilant state, which is exhausting for one. Yeah. And jumping from one foot to another, digital graffiti, and absolutely, I agree with you. The vandalism is got the media up in arms about it with cyber attack. What was it? Even the Ukrainian fellow that did it before the war started, massive cyber attack, and it was like a defacing of a website. It's not a massive cyber attack. Like even the narratives are just so visceral. It's like easy because now you're going to create fatigue. And that's the perfect utility. Fatigue here is where they take advantage of a massive amount of opportunity.
Is that
I
where we're
worry about
switch?
What's that, Jay?
Is that where we're seeing a switch though, like of the techniques that they use? Like obviously it's different, like in the war zone where they're actually taking out utilities and stuff like that, versus we're outside of that, but we're still at risk. Do we see that there's less of a need for a deeper technical foothold within an organization? So take something like Colonial Pipeline, right? You don't actually have to affect the actual pipeline. You can affect the billing system, and then you get everybody jumping on saying, "Oh my gosh, we're running," and we DOS ourselves. And there's less risk when we mentioned earlier the whole social media aspect, the disinformation aspect. like, is it changing now where it's like, you know what, I don't need to get super deep into that organization or that critical infrastructure. I need a small foothold enough to raise doubt that then will start running rampant across all of media, and especially in a situation where, like I said, we're not in Ukraine, right? We're not a direct target of they're gonna shut our infrastructure down. But if I can do it a roundabout way and indirectly and say, okay, well, if I just do this small little thing, the media will help me shut that down. And now I can say, look, I didn't do it. All I did was this. Or, we're focusing on the social media side, which might be more difficult attribution wise. I don't know, right? Because it's not directly like there's no firewall logs I'm looking at for that. It is, how did this actually happen?
Well, James, I'll throw this out, and keen to hear what the other guys have to say about this. But certainly for the industry, this is nothing new. But SolarWinds changed the game substantially for people to start worrying about supply chain. Like that, man, founded my company in 2017 based on that problem, because it was a problem that was abundantly clear for years and years and years before. But it finally hit mainstream consciousness in a big way with SolarWinds. So now it's, to your point, James, it's not even about the actual target. It's about the periphery of the target. And it's about the connectivity and the trusted connections into that target. And so you just kind of rabbit hole, excuse the pun, this risk, profiling to everything, right? It becomes almost insurmountable to sort of say, look, can I, it reminds me a little bit of the biological pandemic, where it's like, you were just scared of your own shadow and everyone else around you, your family members and everything else. And it's just gotten to be way too much. It's not that there's not risk there. I'm not trying to minimize that or try to detract from the fact that you should be very vigilant about making sure you know where you're, what could be coming in through a trusted connection. Your point about the VPN access, right? But it has gotten to the point where it almost gets to be a spaghetti mess that can be very hard to unwind. And that confusion's adding to this, right? I think in a big way.
Well, that adds that complexity of something as simple as a denial of service attack or defacement of a website, right? That graffiti that we call it actually may just be the catalyst for that next phase. Like, all I needed was to plant that seed, and we'll let other things kind of run with it, and so it doesn't look like we're really doing anything, but all of a sudden this doubt occurred and something major actually comes out of it without doing anything.
Yeah, well, all you really need is something that affects Wall Street. Because, as I said, we are in an economic war with Russia, and we are using our tools to hurt their economy, to bend them to our will. So they're going to do something. If they're going to strike back, if they're going to say, okay, we'll take up the dropped gauntlet, we'll fight the economic war with you, they would do something that's enough to affect our economy. And the as you pointed out, James, the more they scare us, the more it works.
And there's a couple of perspectives to take on this. So for an earlier point that you made, James, referencing something like Colonial Pipeline, where I don't even have to necessarily touch a operational asset. I can just create the impression that I may have done so, or something similar. This sense of integrity reduction or integrity focused intrusion. Another example would be looking at the Triton event and the potential arbitrary modification of a safety system in an industrial environment. That this starts taking us beyond the realm of sort of computer network annoyance, where we're defacing websites and whatnot, into items that can have significant implications for process safety and process integrity, leading to potential physical disruption. And the problem with those sorts of items, and I got in an argument with Rob Lee on this with Colonial Pipeline a couple of weeks ago, is any sane operator, if they want to try to maintain safety and the security of the process, not security in an information sense, but like very physical integrity of the process, they can't operate. And absent the ability to perform root cause analysis, like, well, I can prove that the actor didn't arbitrarily modify something, it becomes very difficult to say that, oh, we're going to be in a good state. And I think that's the big worry for me, not that, oh, the Russians are scanning critical infrastructure in North America and Western Europe. Rather, my worry is that latent points of access that have been developed over decades now can be turned around into modification of items, and we don't have the skills or the visibility necessary to even diagnose if something has taken place. So that's the one thing that scares me. For the latter point of referencing what Mattias was talking about in terms of economic warfare, it reminds me a lot of a presentation I gave at CyberWarCon a couple of years ago of really looking for sort of boosted impacts around certain types of intrusions. So we already had some mention of things like, okay, DDoSing websites, but if I pair that with the social media campaign to call into question the availability of financial resources, I can now potentially induce a run on banks. If I all of a sudden start creating a denial of service condition on the trading system for North Sea Brent crude or for West Texas Intermediate, and throw a wrench into trading for that at a time when the oil markets are already very tight and we're already seeing potential supply hiccups, do I then cause a price panic or some way of gumming up the way of trading commodities in such a fashion? I'm not trying to give anyone ideas here, because trust me, people have thought about this already, but it does get towards a sense that it's not just in thinking about, like, how do I change firewall rules or patch some Log4j vulnerability or whatever to make myself secure. It's also about thinking, what could happen to these connected systems that we are relying upon for very fundamental aspects of everyday life, and how do I secure those against an adversary that may already be in them to some extent and has some knowledge about how to disrupt them?
Well, this brings me to an interesting. So as you guys are talking about, and we, I think Karim, you brought up the kind of fatigue aspect of it, right? You can only stay on DEFCON 1 for so long before you start fatiguing out. We've all talked about at length the problem that cyber has with burnout, particularly in the SOC, particularly in operations roles. Now, I think not that I know anything in particular about this, but I think it would be a fair point to say that if I'm an adversary that wants to cause some damage, I'm first going to throw around make a lot of noise to alert the media at large, to induce a panic, which takes the average company into a state of panic. MSPs, companies, enterprises, large and small. And then, 30 days later, when everybody is exhausted from working double shift and investigating every single port scan, then I go in and actually do something meaningful, because I've already got an implant. It's been there for a year, 12 months, 18 months, whatever. I just have to sit quietly, Karim, to your point, and listen for a bit. And once everybody's exhausted, then I make my move. Any validity? I mean, does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me, obviously, because I see kind of the shifting of stage one to another stage, a subsequent stage of infection, based on what appears to be a level of like whack-a-moling within the organization. You can literally see it, this hunting, trying to remove, and hell, even what I'll call patsy malware, stuff that's been delivered intentionally in there to give the security team something to kill, so they can bring the carcass to the, oh, got it, we're good, everyone go home, relax, and you got something that literally was intended to be found, and now what's really there, the true implant, is now dormantly sitting there, probably won't even call out to command and control for a couple of weeks, months, whatever.
Yeah,
who knows? There's another thing that's really concerning. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, please finish, Karim.
Just really quick on the piece that I really wish, is almost imploring politicians to maybe communicate with folks like us a little more about certain decisions. When they started to talk about the SWIFT network situation as a sanction, I'm like, oh man, don't start taking a group off a system they benefit from to then no longer have them have no compunction to attack it for everyone else to benefit from. The SWIFT network is not exactly the most resilient thing in the world. We all kind of know this. It was not built with it, right? And so what bothered me about that political decision was that I don't know that there are enough cybersecurity professionals or people to understand the implications or really give them a thorough analysis of that threat. That's a greater threat to me, to Mattias's point about an economic impact in a big way, because if they're going to be, look, they've got a playbook from Iran already. They've been off of it for a while, and they've got some backups with China for this kind of thing. It may not be as robust as SWIFT, but it's a backup. Look, it's eating hot dogs for a few months. Who cares? You'll survive. I think that this is a concerning thing to me, that I don't know that there was much consulting going on about what are the true ramifications. Are you playing into their hand ultimately? They're goading us into something like that, that then puts them in an even more power position to attack something that benefits them and hurts everyone else. I don't know what everyone else thinks about that, but it's bothered me from the minute they started talking about that.
You want to throw in on that?
Yeah, towards the latter point, once something is removed or taken away, then the risk of losing it is removed, and so why not? Then I could get into YOLOing whatever sort of impact that I want, because it's not impacting me anymore, because I've already been isolated or I've already lost access to a given item. So certainly thinking through second order effects is key, which I think is also a good thing to keep in mind for the earlier point that you were bringing up, Rafal, about, what about just almost denial of servicing a SOC through generating noise or lower level items and then go in for the sort of the killing blow. I would just caution a little bit that from an adversary's perspective, if I can make sure that the defender doesn't see anything, that's probably where I want to live. And once defenders start poking around for something, the possibilities of even inadvertently turning up something else start increasing substantially. So
fair enough.
Like less attention is always better. But having said that, I made this comment recently because a tool was released by some researchers that allow for the generation of arbitrary payloads based on Yara rules. That like, oh man, like if I'm a red teamer, I can go to town on this or whatever and just generate all sorts of host-based noise and false endpoint detections or whatever, and then try to swim underneath that. Like, yeah, that's a possibility, but there is risk that once, sort of the eye of Sauron is on you or whatever, so to speak, within the network, that someone's going to spot something.
Nice reference, Joe.
Yeah.
Guys, I want to switch us over to the now what, because it feels like, at least to me, right? I'm not in the intel space, but it feels like to me, based on what we've heard and in between mass media and the various bulletins that have come out, the various the calls that have, the open calls that have come out, InfraGard, CISA, everybody else, that, and logic would tell me that this isn't like, if the war were to end tomorrow, whatever state that puts Russia in, concession or mild win, the cyber aspect of this isn't going to be done that day, right? We're looking at a protracted, potentially forever standoff in the way that the theater of cyber gets used from a potentially disruptive military and or statecraft kind of sponsored space. That's a long way of saying I don't think this is over. And now what?
Well, one possibility is that whatever way this war ends, it still ends with Russia being an enemy of the West in a way that we will have a variety of sanctions in place even after the war is over, and you may even get a rogue state like North Korea or Iran out of Russia. In which case, well, what did North Korea do? Well, they used their government cyber resource to steal money.
Yeah.
What if the FSB and the GRU starts to deploying ransomware to prop up the economy the way the APT from North Korea done? That's one thing I worry about, not now, but maybe 6 months from now.
That's a good point.
There's a really this whole idea of walled gardening, de-pairing from the internet, the greater internet conversations that's been happening under the surface about Russia. There are a couple memos that went out. I don't know about the authenticity of it. I'd love to get Mattias and Joe's perspective on that. If they do de-peer, it's not that it's ever impossible to find a way to patch back, but it's going to be political at that point. It's more of a political problem than a technical one. And that again is that's like almost a force multiplied version of the Swift problem I was referring to, which is that now all of a sudden, if there's no reason to keep our quote unquote internet intact, or if that becomes fair game, for salting the earth, to use kind of a farming, analogy there. Well, if they start BGP hijacking galore with us, what now? Which they don't do now because they benefit from the greater connectivity. But if they don't need to, conceivably, there's long-reaching ramifications of that. But I'm just thinking that's where that worst case, and I'm not fear-mongering here, I promise. It's just that that's something that's been talked about. It's almost like they're starting, and it's not new. They didn't start it now. This wasn't the war that got them thinking about it. They've been thinking about it forever. It's just a question about when they're going to actually take action on it. And it is quite a bit different than Chinese, firewalling off. This is not about blocking certain access to sites that are Western. This is about flat out decoupling essentially from the greater internet, which is a much, much more dramatic shift in strategy than I think we've probably ever seen.
To take a different perspective on matters that say, and it would be wonderful if this invasion ended tomorrow. It's not going to, but say if it did. Yes, the cybers, the component, as Mattias said, is not going to go away because this has been an ongoing issue and it's a continuous issue. That I would like to think that a lesson learned from this isn't that, hey, pat ourselves in the back, so to speak, because CISA or whomever shared a bunch of IP addresses and a list of common vulnerabilities. Rather, I think we need to take a step back and realize that, wow, if things really had gone bad or hostile, we wouldn't have been prepared. And I think a better analog to this than some of the scanning and other activities to try to look for parallels between what would have happened in the cyber realm with the sort of brittleness that we've seen revealed in more classic supply chains through the pandemic, that we've basically built our entire modern economy and information society on very fragile foundations, and that with a little bit of stress, whether that's come from Russia doing some cyber operations, blowing up some undersea cables or whatever, or heaven knows what else, or attacking the SWIFT system, a lot of bad things would have manifested. And the real takeaway is a re-emphasis or a returning to examine overall resiliency within critical infrastructure, because it just isn't there right now, and it's a glaring weakness for Western societies at the moment.
I'm going to add something to that, because this is something that we were sort of led to believe, that the internet is self-healing, to use an old Cisco term, that it is resilient, that that's sort of the nature of it, right? But those of us that have been in it long enough, between BGP and DNS, you see how fragile it is.
Or AWS US East 1.
What's that?
Or AWS US East 1 going down.
Yeah, right? Out. I mean, you just go and cut the power cable. Not that anybody should get that idea, but right, and suddenly, like, half the world goes dark, and it's amazing how brittle and fragile and just the exact opposite of what a lot of the folks out there believe. Imagine just. Let's make up a fictitious company. Let's call them America Cellular, right? There is a company, and 30% of the population is on their cellular network. The Russians decide that this is the time to strike. They've got some implants in there, and they categorically just damage that network somehow, so that cell phone calls and text messages aren't relayed, and the internet is down for them. A day, 2 days. Like, we've seen T-Mobile and AT&T and Verizon all have multiple day outages for cell and calls in the past. What says that can't happen again? And now you can add that to the fear kind of campaigns that they're really good at generating, and man, that would generate some panic, right? I mean, think about it.
Yeah, another area that is broadly overlooked for the most part, and media certainly hasn't glommed onto it. And I certainly hope I'm not giving the idea to start fear mongering here, but just to check. We don't need any more of that. The satellite. I mean, there was a situation with a group, Snake, or Turla. They went after satellite infrastructure specifically for their process. They used command and control to facilitate and it literally had their dishes in the right direction to collect information in a way that was really sophisticated and sadly elegant. I say it that way because unfortunately, what are you going to do? it becomes a very problematic thing. Think about your GPS in your car. I mean, literally, there's no special. You can be anywhere and do this, and so there's fundamental flaws in that infrastructure too, which we rely on in an incredible way. Not just for broadcast, not just for comms, it's for absolutely everything. It's generally the backup for just about all things, and satellite technology tends to be one of the least pre-built with security into it, which is horrifying to me. But it's very much to Joe's point. We just have not. We've not built things with security in mind that long ago. It's not about new things. It's about ancient infrastructure that can't bolt it to the background quite as easily as you'd like.
Yeah, and there's another thing about this also is that if we do get, actually, as the trend seems to be heading now, slowly of course, but the splinternet, that there's multiple internets, suddenly the biggest deterrent to attacking is gone, namely that you don't want to wreck the internet because we all use it. I mean, it's like, shooting yourself in the head to bleed on your neighbor's carpet to wreck the internet. But if we have several internets and we have our internet and they have their internet, they can damage us and not necessarily be damaged themselves.
Interesting. So I'm going to do this, guys, with a couple minutes left here because we're almost at an hour. I'm going to give you guys each 2 minutes. I'm going to ask a question and give me a 2-minute answer. All right. With what we've just talked about, what should the average defender in the cyber realm, in the enterprise, big companies, mid companies, small companies, what should they be doing right now, and what should they be doing going forward? Different, if anything. Anybody want to go first? 2 minutes.
I can kick it off because it's the same thing I've been teaching for years. Please start thinking about embedded problems, not what's trying to get to you. There's a younger generation, not old fogies like us, are wrapped up in this idea that something's still trying to come in and get them. They're not as zeroed in on what's already embedded. And this idea of watching network traffic egress your network as important as watching what's ingressing in your network. And people don't pay attention. I mean, I have this funny thing I say a lot about what we do. I'm like, if you had only built a good egress rule for your firewall or your IDS, we'd never see anything. We'd be out of business. I would pray that we'd be out of business if you could just build a better way of looking what's trying to communicate outbound from your environment. You can muzzle the threat internally. You have a lot more time to remediate. Your dwell time doesn't matter as much if it's muzzled. So consider that. Don't just fixate on this vulnerability narrative that people are so stuck on. I'm not saying forego that. I'm saying add to it. But that's a big one. That would change a lot.
That's a great one. The outbound rule restriction. And I tell you what, in 20 some odd years, I could probably name and count on just 2 hands the number of companies that I've ever seen that do that holistically and on aggregate, tightly, right? That they really have a tight control on outbound.
Yeah. Watch
that
your
is
DNS.
a tough thing to do.
The DNS logs. I know it's a pain. It's nasty. It can be clogging and it's horrible, but there's value in looking at DNS logs. There's value in collecting DNS information, egress information. So that's under 2 minutes, but probably the best piece of wisdom I can throw out here.
Mattias, Joe?
I would say we as experts need to talk much more to decision makers and journalists in a way that they can understand, so they can begin to understand what is cyber conflict. What is a scary cyber attack, and what is, as I call, digital graffiti, and what's the difference, and help be responsible when we together inform the public what is actually happening. Yes, that is dangerous. This, not so much really, it's more of an annoyance. So everybody, both politicians and as individuals, can make better informed decisions about what's going on around us.
Excellent. That's well said. Joe, I guess you get final word here.
I guess so. And building off of Mattias's point a little bit, one of the things that I teach typically is that no organization exists to run a secure network. Organizations exist to provide some service, to produce some widget, to do something. And the first principle that we need to come back to from as security practitioners is figure out, why are we here? What is important about our organization? And then starting with that foundation to build out from there with, okay, what are the impacts to that primary source of value? How can someone hold that at risk? How can someone deny my organization's ability to perform its function? And map that then to your security service. So if your HR system gets popped, yeah, that sucks. No one likes that, but it's not the same as the EDR system that allows you to automatically process transactions for pipeline distribution goes down and all of a sudden you can't operate. Figuring out what those dependencies are, how to work around them, both from a monitoring and security standpoint, as well as from a resiliency and recovery standpoint is key. And unless we had approach these issues from that perspective, we're just playing whack-a-mole on IPs and people slinging packets over the internet, and that's not sustainable.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Joe. All right, folks, episode 395. I hope this was useful. Thank you so much to the truck ton of you guys that joined us live. That was quite the audience. I wasn't expecting that many, especially this early in the morning East Coast time, but all right. Looks like our panel was a hit, guys. Thanks for Mattias. It's late afternoon for you, but Joe, thanks for getting up early for us. And Karim, as always, good to have you. All right, so as we get to episode 500, keep in mind that we are going to be doing a couple of these, a series of live shows as we get to 500. Tune into those. I'll be posting those very shortly, just 5 weeks away. So holy cow, episode 500, 5 weeks away. James, I don't even believe it. We've gotten through, you've been here through like what, starting at 33 or something, right?
33, yeah. So it's been a few episodes.
Wow. Well, there you go, man. It's been like 9, but you know. All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for joining us. Our awesome panel. We'll probably have you guys back at some point to talk about other stuff, because I like the dynamic here. And for the Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast, this is Raf. We'll catch you guys later. Hopefully you caught the video on LinkedIn Live. Podcast obviously available where you get podcasts. Sign up, spread it to your friends. Share this one with other people that you know in the SOC, because a little bit of realism is a good thing. So thanks again. We'll talk to you guys later, another time, another place, on another Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Ciao, everybody.